Well, you thought joining the Separatist movement would be a smart move, fighting alongside the iconic Count Dooku, or maybe that walking case of asthma in a cloak, General Grievous. It sounded cool on paper, but in reality, being a Separatist kinda sucked. In this video, we're diving into messy and often miserable life on the other side of the Clone Wars, the Separatist side, by imagining you, maybe a regular person, maybe even just a simple droid with terrible aim, trying to survive in a system that was never designed to protect you. So grab a snack, get comfy, and if you enjoy slow journeys through strange history, feel free to subscribe. Now, let's begin. You didn't join the war because you were a freedom fighter. You joined because some rich guys couldn't handle paying taxes. That's the actual origin story of the entire Separatist movement. Just a bunch of corporate executives whining about tariffs. It all started when the Galactic Republic passed a tax on trade routes in the Outer Rim. Why? Because the Republic was broke. The galaxy was growing, infrastructure was falling apart, systems were complaining about lack of support, and someone had to pay for it. So the Senate, in all its wisdom, looked at the shipping lanes and said, what if the people making billions off interstellar trade actually chipped in? Sounds fair, right? But that's wrong. At least if you ask the megacorporations. The Trade Federation, the Techno Union, the Commerce Guild collectively lost their minds. These were the most powerful economic forces in the galaxy. They controlled shipping, droids, fuel, weapons, and loans. So naturally, they pulled the most dramatic move imaginable. They formed a coalition and decided to secede from the Republic altogether. Just imagine that. Imagine Amazon, Google, and SpaceX getting mad at the IRS and starting their own country, complete with droid armies and political figureheads. That's the Confederacy of Independent Systems. That's who you fought for. But here's where it gets even worse. These corporations didn't just leave, they started recruiting, or more accurately, manipulating. They went out into the Outer Rim and started convincing desperate systems to join their cause. They said the Republic didn't care about them, that the Senate was corrupt, that the core worlds were hogging all the power. And you know what? They weren't completely wrong. The Republic was bloated and slow and messy, but it was still a democracy. It still had some accountability. The Separatists? They were run by a boardroom, and yet thousands of systems joined. Some were genuinely fed up. Others just wanted security. Others had no choice. It was all business, hostile takeovers, but with real armies, and as a citizen, you didn't get a say. No one asked you if you wanted to leave the Republic. One day you're under Senate law, and the next your governor is telling you that your planet is now under the protection of the Techno Union. Whatever that means. Your job hasn't changed, your house looks the same, but suddenly there are B-1 battle droids marching down your street and a weird corporate anthem playing during planetary announcements. You didn't get lower taxes, you didn't get more freedom. You didn't even get an explanation. Just a new flag and a bunch of regulations written in fine print by someone who's never set foot on your world. And the worst part? It worked. The movement grew. Because while the Outer Rim was tired of being ignored by the Republic, they didn't realize they were walking into something worse. They were trading in slow bureaucracy for cold exploitation. Republic officials may have been corrupt, but at least they pretended to care. The Confederacy didn't even bother. If it wasn't profitable, it wasn't their problem. So when the war started, when the blasters were drawn and the clones came marching in, who did the fighting? Not the CEOs, not the viceroys or the corporate bigwigs. It was regular people, planetary militias, volunteers, conscripts, and of course, droids, millions of them. You were caught in the middle of a galactic-scale temper tantrum. The Republic wanted control, the corporations wanted money, and you just wanted to survive, maybe feed your family, maybe avoid getting blown up by an orbital bombardment on your way to work. But this wasn't your fight. You didn't sign up for this. You were dragged into it, conscripted by trade barons, who couldn't stand the idea of paying the same tax as anyone else. They put on a mask of nobility, claimed they were standing for justice and independence. And what did they promise in return? Better trade, local control, prosperity? They couldn't even guarantee peace. Your system might get pulled into 5 different campaigns in the same year. One day you're defending a mining moon from clone troopers. The next you're forced to supply resources to a shipyard you've never heard of, in a sector you've never visited. The war wasn't about your system's independence. It was about what your system might get pulled into 5 different campaigns in the same year. And that's how it began, with a trade dispute, with a tariff, with a vote in the Senate that made the wrong people angry. The kind of people who don't start protests, they start wars. You heard the stories before you ever saw him in person. The fearsome General Grievous, the Republic's nightmare, Jedi killer, master of warfare, half alien, half machine, all vengeance supposedly. That's the guy they said was going to lead your forces to victory, the one who would outmaneuver the clones, crush the Jedi, and carve a new future for the Confederacy. So when you finally met him, you expected power, charisma, maybe even some strategy. What you got instead was a coughing fit in a cape. Grievous never walked anywhere. He stormed into rooms like he was trying to scare the floor itself. Every time he moved, something creaked, hissed, or sparked. He didn't just arrive. He announced himself with mechanical stomps and a breathing pattern that made you wonder if someone installed his lungs upside down. He'd throw open the doors, hack up a lung, and launch into some over-the-top speech about Jedi betrayal and Republic tyranny. Half of what he said didn't even make sense, and the cape, flowing behind him like he thought he was royalty. Except instead of inspiring confidence, it just dragged through puddles of fuel and battle droid parts. He looked like a space Dracula with bronchitis. Still, the higher-ups said he was the best you had. He's killed dozens of Jedi, they'd say. He's unpredictable, ruthless. And yeah, sure, Grievous had a record. He had taken out Jedi, he had led assaults, but he also had a habit of retreating just when things got tough, leaving entire battalions behind, while he jetted off to the next hologram meeting. If you ever asked a question he didn't like, he'd lean in close, way too close, and hiss something about your flesh being weak. It was always about flesh with him, like he wanted everyone else to feel bad for not being 90% replacement parts. He was constantly flexing his robotic arms, extending all four of them just to emphasize basic sentences. Let's get serious for a second. Yeah, he had his issues, but behind that mask was a man who saw nothing but war. War and more war, over and over again. General Grievous had a name, a real one. He was Kumail Shilal, a warlord from the planet Kali, known not for theatrics, but for brutal efficiency and loyalty to his people. He didn't start out fighting Jedi. He didn't even care about the Republic. He fought for survival, and that's what makes this part of the story so bitter. Kali wasn't a paradise. It was dry, rocky, and constantly at war. The Kaleesh were proud tribal and locked in a bitter conflict with a technologically superior species called the Yamri, big, aggressive bug-like creatures from the neighbouring planet Hook. The Yamri had expanded into Kaleesh territory and treated the Kaleesh like pests. Naturally, war followed, and Shilal was born into it. He rose through the ranks fast. He was smart, tactical, obsessed with strategy. He studied warfare like it was religion. By his early adult years, he was already a legend on Kali, known for outmaneuvering larger forces and protecting his people with a combination of sheer grit and clever planning. His enemies feared him. His own people worshipped him, not in a cult way, in the way you look at someone and just know they're meant to lead. And he wasn't doing it for ego. He loved his home. He fought for the Kaleesh, not for conquest, for defense. The war against the Yamri wasn't about power. It was about not being wiped off the map. The Yamri had better technology and cleaner propaganda, so the Republic sided with them. The Kaleesh were labelled aggressors. Sanctions were placed on Kali. Food shipments stopped. Republic intervention began. It was a slow death by paperwork, and Shilal couldn't outfight that. That's when the bitterness began. Shilal, like many others, started to hate the Republic, not just for picking the wrong side, but for not even caring to understand. Kali was dying, and no one on Coruscant even noticed. It was all bureaucracy and neutrality, unless you had the money to buy attention. And speaking of money, that's where the intergalactic banking clan came in. They saw Shilal's skill, and they saw an opportunity. The banking clan wasn't emotional. They were cold, calculating, and always investing in the long game. So they approached Shilal through their droid-building partners in the Techno Union. They offered him a deal. Step into a bigger war, bring your genius to the Confederacy. They'd fund him, equip him, give him the chance to strike back at the Republic that ignored his people. It sounded almost noble, but it wasn't. It was bait. Shilal didn't trust them completely, but he needed allies. He agreed to train with them, advise them, maybe even lead a few campaigns. They started calling him Grievous, a nickname at first. He kept his old name for a while, but bit by bit, his identity was being rebranded. Then came the accident. He was on a transport ship, supposedly heading to a training facility, when it exploded mid-flight. No one ever proved who did it, but let's not kid ourselves. It wasn't random. The Techno Union, under banking clan influence, had been experimenting with cybernetic enhancement. They wanted a general who was loyal, deadly, and replaceable. Sheila was the test subject. The accident was step 1. He barely survived. Burned, broken, and barely conscious, they recovered what was left of him and brought him to a secret facility on Geonosis. He didn't ask for a new body. He didn't volunteer to become a droid hybrid. They decided that for him. And then they rebuilt him, piece by piece. The body they gave him wasn't for healing. It was for war. Armor-plated limbs, internal power cells, backup systems for backup systems. They even redesigned his brain interface to make him more aggressive, less emotional, less independent. They told him it was to save his life. What they didn't tell him was that Dooku had been involved. The Sith needed a champion, a general who could rival Jedi and intimidate enemies. So Dooku personally supervised the process, even providing blood from a Force-sensitive warrior to enhance the result. It wasn't enough to make Grievous Force-sensitive, but it did make him more reactive, more volatile. When Shilal woke up, he was no longer just a warrior. He was Grievous now, full-time. They handed him his new title, his new lightsabers, and a new purpose. And to make sure he stayed angry, they told him the Republic was behind the explosion. They never said it outright, just hinted, suggested, played the recording a few times. Let him stew in it. That's all it took. With no family left, no home to return to, and now stuck in a body that hissed with every breath, the Republic ruined his life. The Jedi turned their backs on his people. The Separatists gave him power. It wasn't the truth, but it felt close enough. Your new body was a cage, but a powerful one. You were told it could withstand anything, that you were superior to Jedi now, that your arms could crush steel, your legs leap stories high, and your body would survive impacts that would destroy any normal soldier. But you weren't just turned into a weapon, you were turned into a showpiece. They put you on display. They gave you a command post at the head of the Separatist droid army. At first you didn't understand why. You hated droids. You hated their cold efficiency, their lack of soul, their blind obedience. They didn't remind you of soldiers, they reminded you of slaves. But that was the point. You were the only living general the Separatists needed. Dooku called you the face of the war effort. But when you spoke, your voice echoed like a malfunctioning comlink, distorted by metal and rage. You tried to lead like you did in the days of the Kaleesh War. Fast, brutal, decisive. But now, everything was slower, bureaucratic, calculated. You were asked to minimize damage, prolong engagements, maintain pressure. What they wanted wasn't victory, it was distraction. You were never meant to win the war. You were meant to keep it going. Every time you pushed too hard, Dooku held you back. Every time you demanded to strike at Coruscant or capture key systems, the Council said it wasn't strategically viable. Even the assassination of Jedi Masters, which you took great pride in, was seen as too aggressive by your handlers. They feared you would go rogue, and they were right to. But here's the part they didn't understand. You weren't fighting for them. You were still fighting for the Kaleesh, even if they didn't realize it, even if they hated what you'd become. The moment you were strong enough, you vowed you'd use the resources of the Confederacy to retake your planet's independence. Not just from the Republic, but from everyone. You didn't care about Dooku's dream of a galaxy reborn. You didn't care about the Trade Federation's greed, or the banking clan's games. You played along because you needed their ships, their credits, and their droids. But your war was your own, and every Jedi you killed was part of that war. You made it a ritual. Every time you defeated a Jedi in battle, you took their lightsaber. You studied their movements, their fighting forms. You used their own tactics against them. Over time, you became more than just a mechanical brute. You became a duelist, a tactician, a killer. Your collection of lightsabers grew with every campaign. Proof that you were still stronger than they were, that you could kill them without the Force, that no matter what body they put you in, your will was still your own. But you couldn't deny the truth forever. You weren't healing anymore. You were decaying. Your body was rusting from the inside. Your organs, the few that remained, were failing. Your lungs, artificial and wheezing, constantly needed repair. Your reaction times were degrading. Your cybernetics required more and more maintenance after each battle. You stopped resting between missions. You couldn't. Every time you closed your eyes, you felt like you might never wake up. Your rage was the only thing keeping you functional. But even that wasn't yours anymore. They installed failsafes. You found them. Hidden routines in your central system. Hard-coded overrides. You couldn't speak of them, couldn't remove them. If you went too far, they could shut you down instantly. Dooku never trusted you. He called you general, but he treated you like a test subject. Sidious never even acknowledged you. To him, you weren't Sith. You weren't apprentice material. You were a side project. A dog trained to bark at the Jedi while the real plan unfolded behind the curtain. And yet the galaxy feared you more than either of them. To the people, you were a monster, a Jedi killer. The cyborg butcher, Republic propaganda turned you into a nightmare. To me, Grievous was a tragic case. This guy was just stuck in a cycle of war. First fighting for his planet, then getting manipulated, then turned into a weapon. He was used by everyone. Your droids were supposed to be the backbone of the Separatist army, a million-strong metal wall ready to crush the Republic. What you actually got? A bunch of walking skeletons made out of recycled scrap, who announced their presence louder than a pod race on Malastare. The B-1s couldn't shoot straight, couldn't aim under pressure, and couldn't walk more than 10 steps without tripping over each other. They'd charge into a battle yelling "Roger, Roger," like it was supposed to intimidate someone. And the worst part, they never shut up. Half the time, they were too busy making sarcastic comments, complaining about their legs, or asking obvious questions like, "Is that a Jedi?" 2 seconds before getting cut in half. They weren't soldiers, they were background noise, and sure, the idea was that they were expendable and cheap to mass produce. But even that logic fell apart fast when one Republic trooper with a jetpack could wipe out an entire squad without breaking a sweat. You didn't need Jedi to beat them, you just needed someone who knew how to reload. It's one thing to lose a battle, it's another thing to lose a battle while your army's cracking jokes and accidentally walking into walls. The worst part was that droids had no instinct. They didn't adapt, didn't learn from mistakes, and couldn't read a battlefield. If a Jedi turned up, the B-1s might scream and run in circles, while the B-2s just kept marching forward like they didn't notice the lightsaber spinning toward their head. It was less of a fight and more of a countdown. You didn't wonder if they'd lose, only how long they'd last before shutting down mid-sentence. And let's not forget how easily hacked they were. One guy with the right access codes could shut down an entire battalion. It's hard to act intimidating when the enemy can just plug into your command signal and turn off your whole army like a holo projector. The worst part? You knew all this and kept building more. The Techno Union, the Banking Clan, the Trade Federation, all of them were obsessed with numbers. Efficiency, profit, production output. To them, the droid army wasn't about victory, it was about margins. They weren't designed to win, they were designed to be replaced. Just build another 1,000, ship them out, repeat. That's why your army looked like a junkyard had come to life. Sure, you had advanced droids like the droidicas, the rolling ones with the shields, and even those spider-legged tanks, but they were the exception, not the rule. 90% of the time, it was just long lines of droids marching straight into gunfire while yelling "blast them" with the same recycled voice line from every mission. And when your tactical droids stepped in to coordinate, it didn't get much better. Sure, they were smarter than the B-1s, but that wasn't a high bar. Most of the time, they just stood there, trying to sound sophisticated, while getting blown up before they could even finish calculating their next move. Their greatest achievement was probably lasting 5 extra minutes before exploding. Meanwhile, on the other side of the war, you had clone troopers. Individually trained, coordinated, capable of learning, and actually motivated to survive. Even without a Jedi leading them, they functioned as a tight-knit unit. They used cover, they flanked, they adapted. The clones joked around too, sure, but they could back it up. Your droids? They were like a failed comedy act that didn't realize the stage was on fire. When things went wrong, the blame didn't even go to the people who built the droids. It always landed on the battlefield commanders, like Grievous, or some poor Neimoidian trying to hold a control station together, while a Jedi carved through his entire division. It was like trying to win a race, using shopping carts with wheels that fall off when you push too hard. Even if you were a military genius, you were stuck commanding an army that could barely form a straight line without crashing into each other. Every planet you sent them to ended up being the same disaster. A beachhead taken, a few clone patrols overwhelmed, and then, 5 minutes later, everything collapsing the moment someone with an actual brain showed up. The Jedi weren't just winning because of the Force, They were winning because your army wasn't built to survive contact with a living opponent. So while the rest of the galaxy feared the war, the Republic knew what to expect from your side. Tin cans with rifles, no aim, no tactics, no real threat unless you outnumbered them 20-1. And even then, they'd probably still lose. It wasn't a battle, it was a slow-motion malfunction. I mentioned B2 droids before. Well, the B2 was tougher. It didn't talk as much, which was already a huge improvement. And it had those built-in blasters that looked cool when they actually worked. But smarter, more precise? Nope. You just had a bigger, angrier metal can, still incapable of basic tactics. They walked in straight lines, ignored cover like it was optional, and when they ran into Jedi, they still got turned into scrap piles, just slightly heavier ones. And then the designers got creative. Droidecas, rolling space crabs with twin blasters and shields. Now these guys actually looked scary. They could cut down squads of clones and had that signature spin and unfold entrance like they were showing off. Problem was, they were expensive, they couldn't go upstairs, and they needed about a football field of space to deploy properly. You built the deadliest droid in your army and forgot to test it in narrow hallways. Still, not satisfied, the Separatists pushed for more specialized units. That's when things really got weird. You had commando droids, kind of intimidating. Finally, some droids that could actually think on their feet, until you realized they cost about 10 times more than a standard B1 and still broke apart if a Wookiee sneezed near them. Or the Magna Guards. Now these were supposed to be Grievous's elite bodyguards. Creepy red eyes, electrostaffs, the whole package. And they could keep fighting even with limbs chopped off, which made them look impressive, until you noticed that Jedi like Obi-Wan could dismantle them one-handed while giving a speech about the Republic. So much for elite, but it's not just about how they fought, it's how they acted. The B1s never stopped talking. The B2s tried to act like tough guys, but still got outsmarted by clone rookies. The droidicas were terrifying in theory and inconvenient in practice. You never quite figured out the formula. You either had droids that were cheap and dumb, or expensive and slightly less dumb, and you built millions of them. Every time your army showed up on a planet, it was like watching a machine malfunction in real time. They'd deploy in perfect formation, march confidently into the open, and then get torn apart by clones hiding behind a rock. Their programming couldn't keep up. A clone trooper could think, adapt, make choices on the fly. Your droids could only follow pre-programmed battle strategies written by a guy who probably never left a lab. So while the clones were learning and evolving, your army was still running version 1.0. Even when your side won a battle, it felt like dumb luck. Like the enemy just tripped harder than you did. And let's not forget how much they relied on central command. One signal jam, one sliced frequency, or one control ship blown out of the sky. And every single droid in the field just stopped. Imagine being a Separatist general and watching your entire army freeze because Anakin Skywalker got cocky and flew a ship into your control tower. It was embarrassing. There was never a moment where you felt proud of your droid army. You could try to pretend like they were just there to buy time for your real strategy, like stalling the Republic while you moved behind the scenes. But deep down, everyone knew. The clones respected each other, the Jedi trusted their troops. But your side, you watched as tin cans tripped over each other and got stuck in cargo doors, and just hoped no one made eye contact with you in the war room. You can try to blame it on the manufacturers, the Trade Federation, the Techno Union, the banking clan, but really, it was the whole idea from the start. The droids were never built to win. They were built to look scary in a parade, and the moment they ran into real resistance, they crumbled faster than a sandcastle in a Tatooine dust storm. And still, you kept producing more. Like maybe if you threw enough scrap metal at the problem, the Jedi would eventually just trip over it. Spoiler alert, they didn't. They sliced through your ranks like they were brushing off lint. And even when you started deploying Grievous, your droids were still the comedic warm-up act. By the time he arrived on the battlefield, the clones had already taken out half your forces by just standing behind cover and aiming properly. In the end, your droid army became a running joke, even to themselves. They were built for war, but programmed for disaster. A loud, clumsy, metallic disaster that somehow cost billions of credits and still couldn't hit a target standing still. So, you needed a full-scale army. The Jedi had clones, ships, tanks, precision laser artillery, and a bottomless military budget from the Republic. You had Wat Tambor, a metal-shelled man who wheezed like a dying microwave every time he tried to speak, and who probably used his own body as a test chamber for droid parts. Wat Tambor, Techno-Union executive, supreme droid production genius, and possibly the galaxy's worst public speaker. Every time this guy entered a room, it was like someone accidentally activated a car alarm. Beeping, buzzing, hissing. It never stopped. It wasn't clear whether he was communicating or having a medical emergency. And yet this was the face of your industrial backbone. The man in charge of the factories that were supposed to churn out the hardware you'd use to defeat the Republic. Wat Tambor was in every strategy meeting, every hologram briefing, every council vote, just standing there, adjusting his chest dial like he was tuning into a cooking show from another planet. Now, the Techno-Union itself was no small player. Their reach was massive. They had factories on dozens of worlds, shipping lanes, mining contracts, and most importantly, a bottomless assembly line for droids. Which sounds like a dream until you realize those factories were run like a mix between a scrapyard and a kindergarten. You'd order a battalion of AAT tanks, and half of them would arrive missing a turret. Ask for advanced commando units. Hope you enjoy the batch that confuses flank with explode in place. Tambor's philosophy was basically, why fix it if we can just mass produce it broken? He didn't care about quality. He didn't care about field testing. If it moved, beeped, and could hold a blaster without instantly falling apart, it was ready for war. And if it exploded within the first 5 minutes of deployment, well, guess what? It just cleared the runway for the next 10 units rolling off the line. The word durability was not in Wat Tambor's vocabulary, or maybe it was, but he just couldn't pronounce it through all the static. And don't even get started on his idea of innovation. You'd think someone in charge of a galactic tech union would be designing sleek, powerful, cutting-edge weapons. Nope. Tambor's creations looked like what you'd get if you let a Jawa build a toaster out of speeder parts. Bulky, clunky, and often shaped like a blender with legs. You could tell when a new wave of Techno-Union gear showed up, because the battlefield suddenly smelled like burning metal and fear. And then there were the droid voice lines. Somewhere deep in one of Tambor's factories, a poor intern was assigned to program the personalities of thousands of droids. That intern must have hated his job, because instead of professional, intimidating soldier behavior, you got combat units who spent more time complaining than shooting. These weren't war machines. They were tired office workers with anxiety issues. And yet Tambor stood there, proud of it all. Proud of the tactical failure that was the OGB-1 droid. Proud of the spider droids that could barely turn around without stepping on their own legs. Proud of the oversized cannons that couldn't hit a barn from 10 meters away. Wat Tambor's idea of victory was flooding the map with as many confused robots as possible and hoping the Republic tripped over them on the way to the objective. And Tambor wasn't exactly subtle about his priorities either. He wasn't fighting for justice or independence or the future of the galaxy. He was fighting for contracts. He was the kind of guy who showed up to a battlefield wearing his company logo like it was Casual Friday. Every battle was a marketing opportunity. And when the opportunity came to really leave his mark, like on Ryloth, what did he do? He filmed it. He literally broadcast his war crimes like it was a reality show. Civilians trapped in a city? Turn on the gas. Turn up the broadcast. Smile for the camera, Wat. He even had the nerve to do it slowly, adjusting his dials mid-genocide like he was making fine wine. And when Republic forces closed in, when it became clear that maybe his plan wasn't going to work, he didn't panic, he didn't surrender, he just started fiddling with his dial again, like that was going to fix the situation. And then ran. Classic Tambor. But even when things fell apart, Tambor kept bouncing back. Why? Because the Separatists were stuck with him. He controlled too much of the supply chain. You couldn't build a droid without his factories. You couldn't launch a full-scale invasion without his tech. It was like having a malfunctioning vending machine as your only food source. So there he stayed, buzzing, glitching, and making static noises in the background of every major decision. The most important guy you never wanted to talk to, and somehow one of the few separatist leaders who managed to make a complete mess of things without needing a lightsaber or a giant superweapon. You needed a leader. Someone who didn't look like a malfunctioning droid or sound like they were gargling motor oil. Someone with style, presence, and a working vocabulary. And somehow, that job landed in the hands of a former Jedi who looked like he gave lectures for fun and collected lightsabers the way some people collect antique mugs. Count Dooku, or Darth Tyrannus, if you were in on the Sith drama, became the poster boy for your movement. Tall, elegant, with that fancy cape and a curved lightsaber hilt that practically screamed, "I'm too refined for this war." He wasn't just your leader, he was the Separatist brand. If the Confederacy of Independent Systems had an official cologne, it would have been Eau de Dooku, with hints of betrayal, vintage Jedi guilt, and subtle notes of galactic unrest. And he wasn't just stylish. Dooku had presence. He didn't shout like General Grievous. He didn't stutter like Wat Tambor. He didn't need to threaten anyone with super weapons. He walked into planetary councils with his hands behind his back, started talking about Republic corruption in that silky voice of his, and planets just joined. A calm speech, a dramatic pause, and a perfectly groomed beard. People actually listened to him. Entire sectors turned their backs on the Republic because this one guy gave them a PowerPoint presentation about injustice. He wasn't a warlord, he was a disappointed professor who made you feel like you'd failed his ethics class. And he was so good at it. Even the Jedi Council who knew he'd turned still had to admit, yeah, he makes a few decent points. This man was a Sith Lord. His job wasn't to lead you to victory, it was to lead you into chaos. Because behind every speech and every elegant duel, Dooku was reporting to someone else, Darth Sidious, the man who was secretly running the Republic while you were busy tossing B-1 battle droids into meat grinders. The entire Separatist movement, a prop in Sidious's master plan, and Dooku, just another actor playing his role with a dramatic flair. You thought he was your leader. In reality, he was setting you up like dominoes. His real job was to keep the war going. That's it. Not to win, not to lose too fast. Just keep it going. Stir the pot, scare the senators, make the Jedi look like warmongers. Meanwhile, Palpatine quietly absorbed more emergency powers, like a kid finding cheat codes in a strategy game. And Dooku? He played both sides so well, it's almost impressive. You couldn't tell when he was lying, because he lied so smoothly, it sounded like philosophy. And while your droid armies were getting turned into scrap metal, and your factories were blowing up because Wat Tambor couldn't stop tweaking the budget, Dooku was having candlelit dinners in ancient Sereno palaces. He wasn't marching through muddy trenches. He wasn't giving orders from a musty bunker. He was in pristine halls, surrounded by priceless art, holding secret Sith meetings between glasses of wine. He didn't even bother showing up to most battles. He'd just send General Grievous out to do the dirty work. Dooku preferred to stay behind the scenes until it was time for a dramatic duel with a Jedi, in which case he showed up in a flowing cape and theatrical lighting. He wasn't just a politician, he was a drama major with a lightsaber. And here's the tragedy. Many of the systems that followed him, they genuinely believed in his message. They wanted independence. They wanted fair trade, local governance, freedom from corruption. They thought Dooku was the guy who could lead them there, but the whole time he was stringing them along, buying time for Sidious, playing the galaxy like a hollow instrument. Even the Jedi, who knew he had fallen, couldn't quite shake the weird respect they had for him. Yoda trained him. Obi-Wan almost considered his offer. Anakin eventually got so fed up he cut off both his hands and took his head for good measure. He thought he could finish the war, reform the Republic his way, and become the true heir of the Sith. But this is the Sith we're talking about. There's always betrayal. There's always one master, one apprentice. And if you think you're both, you're probably wrong. So while you were painting separatist logos on your ships and chanting slogans about freedom, Dooku was sitting in the shadows, preparing a galaxy-wide puppet show with himself in the middle. And you were just another string. Now, let's rewind a bit. If Dooku became the separatist icon, how did a once-respected Jedi end up leading the biggest anti-Republic movement in galactic history? From the very start, it was clear that Dooku wasn't like the others. He was better. Not in the arrogant way that comes later, not yet, but in the quiet, unmistakable way that some kids are just built different. He was sharper, faster. He grasped the Force like it was second nature, and not just the simple things like floating pebbles or sensing emotions. He was drawn to the deeper, stranger parts of the Force, the mysteries the instructors usually left for much later. He read too much, trained too hard, spoke too formally for a child. Most initiates struggled to pass basic saber drills. Dooku could duel instructors by the time he was a teenager. And not just win, but make it look easy. He didn't seek attention, but it always found him. The masters whispered about him in the halls. Even the other younglings started to treat him differently. Not out of fear, but out of the quiet awe that comes from watching someone who makes everything look effortless. He wasn't a troublemaker. He followed the rules, but even when he obeyed, it felt like he was doing it by choice. Not because he believed in them, but because he was curious where they led. And then came Master Yoda. And yes, that's the same Yoda who turned down all vacation days for 900 years and still found time to beat up Sith Lords in his free time. It's rare, almost unheard of, for Yoda to personally take on a Padawan. By that point in his life, Yoda had trained hundreds of Jedi through group lessons and brief assignments, but only a handful had ever been chosen as his one-on-one student. When Yoda picked Dooku, it shocked the temple. It validated everything the other masters had sensed. This wasn't just a gifted child, this was someone the Force was watching. Under Yoda's guidance, Dooku didn't just grow stronger, he grew more thoughtful. He studied diplomacy, history, and philosophy with the same intensity he brought to lightsaber combat. He became obsessed with understanding the galaxy, not just protecting it. He questioned everything, not in a disruptive way, but in the way of someone who couldn't help but notice cracks in the foundation. Why do Jedi serve the Senate if the Senate is corrupt? Why does the Council claim to be neutral while secretly pulling strings across the galaxy? At first, the Council praised his curiosity. Jedi are supposed to seek knowledge, but over time, it became harder to answer his questions. His debates became sharper, his tone more pointed. He would bring up contradictions in the Jedi Code during lectures. He didn't shout or accuse, he simply asked things no one wanted to answer. But even then, he wasn't hostile. He was still Dooku, refined, composed, thoughtful. He believed in justice. He believed in the Force. He still respected the Order, even as he began to see its limits. He rose through the ranks quickly, becoming a knight and later a respected master. He trained his own Padawans, including Qui-Gon Jinn, a student who mirrored many of his own tendencies. Thoughtful, independent, a little too questioning for the Council's taste. As a Jedi Master, Dooku became one of the most recognizable and well-respected members of the Order. He negotiated peace between warring systems, prevented full-scale invasions with just words, and earned the trust of countless worlds. And through it all, he kept watching the Senate spiral into corruption, watching the Jedi grow more passive, watching the Republic inch closer to collapse. His frustration grew slowly, over years. It wasn't a sudden break, it was erosion. Doubt piled on doubt, moment by moment. He saw senators take bribes. He saw worlds beg for help and be ignored. He didn't hate the Jedi, but he stopped believing they were the solution. And then came Galidran, a skirmish on a distant world that changed everything. Dooku was sent to intervene in a conflict involving Mandalorians, but the mission, misinformed and politically manipulated, resulted in unnecessary deaths, Jedi deaths, Mandalorian deaths, all because of bad intel and worse politics. Dooku followed orders, people died, and the Council didn't want to talk about it. That was the last straw. Imagine being one of the wisest Jedi of your generation and realizing your bosses were more interested in peace treaties with shady corporations than actually helping people. That's the kind of frustration that brews into a full-on identity crisis. So, Dooku did the unthinkable. He left. He literally walked out of the Jedi Order. A well-dressed, elegant exit. That was his style. Quiet rebellion, philosophical detachment. But make no mistake, he didn't leave because he wanted a quieter life. He left because he believed the Jedi were no longer serving the will of the Force. They had become soldiers, politicians, diplomats. Everything a Jedi was never supposed to be. And the galaxy noticed. Not because a Jedi left, that happened from time to time, but because this Jedi left. A Count of Sereno, a noble, a master. He wasn't some Padawan who got bored, he was Dooku. His departure wasn't just symbolic, it was a scandal. It was a warning bell no one listened to. He returned to Sereno, his ancestral home, and reclaimed his title as Count. Suddenly, he wasn't just a former Jedi. He was a political player with wealth, power, and an army of advisors. And that's when the real fun began, because that quiet disillusionment, it started mutating. Dooku didn't just dislike the Jedi, he began to see them as part of the problem, a symptom of the Republic's decay. That's when Darth Sidious showed up. Now, If you've ever been at your lowest, questioning your life choices, and then a creepy guy in a cloak offers you clarity and power, you might want to double check what religion he's selling. But Dooku, he was already halfway there. Angry, disillusioned, bitter. He didn't see the Sith as evil, he saw them as honest. At least they weren't pretending to be peacekeepers while propping up a corrupt regime. So, he made the choice. He became Darth Tyrannus. More confidence, more distance, a darker philosophy. He didn't abandon his elegance, he just redirected it. He kept his cape, his wine, his sarcasm, but now he had Sith training under his belt, and a job to do. And that job? Recruiting armies. Dooku became the middleman of galactic chaos. He hired bounty hunters like Jango Fett to provide the DNA for what would become the clone army. He built alliances with corporate powers like the Trade Federation, the Banking Clan, the Techno Union, basically every shady galactic startup that hated paying taxes. And he sold them all a dream: independence from the Republic, freedom from Jedi oversight, a better future. Of course, he forgot to mention that this future was secretly being scripted by his Sith boss, who planned to wipe them all out once the timing was right. But Dooku believed he could control it, which is the first mistake every Sith apprentice makes. To the public, he was a revolutionary. To the Jedi, a traitor. To Sidious, a tool. And for you, he was the calm voice in the storm, the man who made treason sound noble. You wanted a movement. What you got was a galaxy-wide misdirection campaign, led by a guy who could give a TED talk and a Sith lecture in the same sentence. And here's the tragedy. Maybe Dooku did believe in some of it. Maybe deep down, he meant what he said. Maybe he really did think the Republic was broken and that the Jedi had lost their way. But he also thought he could outsmart a Sith Lord. He thought he could guide the galaxy from the shadows without becoming the very darkness he claimed to despise. That's how he ended up leading a fake war, believing in a fake future, and commanding an army of rusty droids whose greatest combat tactic was walking into walls. And you were still following him because he made it sound noble, because he told you what you wanted to hear. It was supposed to be just another mission. The Separatists had retreated to Coruscant's outer defense lines, and Count Dooku, leader of the Confederacy, stood aboard the Invisible Hand, watching the Republic fleet move in. Another round in the game, another day to keep the war running just long enough for Sidious to finish his master plan. And once again, Dooku was the bait. He had done this before. He had let the Jedi chase him. He had dueled Obi-Wan Kenobi more times than he could count, and Anakin Skywalker was always nearby. Brash, reckless, eager to fight. The kid was still learning, still easy to read, still manageable. That's what Sidious had said too. Let them board the ship, test Skywalker again, push him. That was the key. The plan was clear, and Dooku had heard it straight from Sidious. Wear the Jedi down, trap them, and then let Skywalker win. But not too easily. He had to feel the fight. He had to earn the kill, just enough to tempt him. Then Sidious would step in and offer him the final push toward the dark side. Dooku was even told what to say during the duel. He was playing a part, just like always. So when the Jedi stormed the Invisible Hand, Dooku was calm. He greeted them like an actor who knew his lines. And in the opening moments of the fight, everything went the way it usually did. The lightsabers clashed, sparks flew, and for a few minutes, it was almost routine. Dooku had fought Skywalker before. He'd defeated him without much effort on Geonosis. He'd bested him again during the war, but this time, the young Jedi was different, stronger, faster, and far, far angrier. Dooku could feel it. There was no hesitation in Skywalker's strikes, no second guessing, and then Obi-Wan was out of the fight, unconscious, crumpled against the wall, and it was just the two of them. Anakin didn't stop. He pressed harder and harder, rage pouring off him like heat from a furnace. Dooku started losing ground. His footing slipped, his rhythm cracked, and suddenly he was disarmed, literally, both hands severed, on his knees, breath shallow, eyes wide. And then Palpatine, with that his line. Dooku turned. He looked at the Chancellor, his master, his partner, the one who had given him purpose after he left the Jedi. Surely there was a moment of hesitation. Surely this was the part where Sidious stopped the act, where he said, "Good work, my apprentice," and revealed the next step in their plan. But there was nothing. It didn't make sense. This wasn't the plan. Dooku looked back at Anakin, and for the first time in a long while, There was fear in his eyes. Anakin's lightsabers crossed, his and Dooku's own. And then the Count's head hit the floor. Just like that, after decades of playing the Republic and Confederacy against each other, after all the speeches, all the strategy, all the careful manipulation, Count Dooku was gone in an instant. He was never meant to survive that mission. He just hadn't realized it until the end. Sidious had used him from the very beginning. Dooku thought he was part of a grand plan, a necessary piece of the Sith's future. He imagined that he and Sidious would reshape the galaxy together, that the Jedi would fall and he would rise as the new order took hold. Maybe he even believed he would help build something better. But in truth, he was nothing more than a stepping stone, a training exercise, a placeholder until someone stronger, younger, and more pliable came along. Anakin Skywalker had just graduated. The moment Dooku fell, the Sith moved to their next phase. Sidious didn't even flinch, didn't even pause. He just shifted into the next act. The war would continue. General Grievous would become the new face of the Separatists. The Jedi would keep fighting until they were too weak to resist. And Anakin, furious, confused, shaken by what he'd done, would be groomed to take Dooku's place. That was the final irony. Dooku, the fallen Jedi, who thought he had escaped the Republic's corruption, died as a casualty of the very system he had helped build. His grand rebellion was a lie. His vision of a free galaxy, twisted into a justification for war. The army he helped lead, programmed to be replaced, and his master, always looking ahead to the next tool, the next pawn, the next sacrifice. In the end, Count Dooku was not the mastermind. He was not the liberator. He was not even the villain he believed himself to be. He was a discarded piece of the puzzle. A chapter closed not with glory, but with silence. Just another casualty in a war that was never really about the Separatists or the Republic or even the Jedi. It was about power. And power doesn't mourn the ones who helped build it. So let's speak about Sidious, this mastermind that planned everything, his first moves and manipulations. So how do you start a galactic war and still come out looking like the hero? Easy. You build both sides. And that's exactly what Darth Sidious did. Years before the Clone Wars, when most politicians were busy arguing about shipping lanes and tax zones, Palpatine was already laying the groundwork for a conflict that would engulf the galaxy. Sidious didn't start with battle plans. He started with discontent. He knew the Republic was bloated and broken, full of corruption and lobbyists, but instead of trying to fix it, he decided to break it further. His plan was to push it to its limits, slowly, over time, until entire sectors started looking for a way out. But for people to believe in a separatist cause, it had to look like a genuine political movement, not a Sith project. That's where Dooku came in. Dooku personally recruited the heads of these organizations. Wat Tambor, Nute Gunray, San Hill. Sidious didn't just promise the corporations power, he gave them blueprints, designs for new droid armies, safe zones to build their factories, political cover for their breakaways. Dooku's charm helped, sure, but it was Sidious who funneled the resources behind the scenes. He made sure every faction had what they needed: ships, weapons, propaganda, even backdoor connections to Republic officials who would delay response times just long enough for a separatist planet to declare independence. And while all this was happening, Sidious kept his own face squeaky clean. As Chancellor Palpatine, he gave speeches about unity and peace. He publicly condemned Dooku and the separatists. He looked sad and disappointed. Meanwhile, in the shadows, he whispered orders, told Gunray what to blockade, told Tambor what to build, and ensured that every flare-up in the Outer Rim would create more fear in the Senate chambers. That's the brilliance of it. The plan wasn't built overnight. It was 1,000 small moves. Every time the Senate refused to intervene in a conflict, it made the Republic look weaker. Every time a planet declared independence, it looked like the Chancellor was losing control. But all of that was intentional, because the more unstable the galaxy became, the more power the Senate gave to the Chancellor to fix it. And what about the clones? To be honest, some say that was Sidious, that he sent Separatist to order the clones. But actually, from the sources and lore that I found, it was that Separatist had a terrifying vision of a galactic-scale conflict erupting. He saw chaos, civil war, planetary systems on fire. In his vision, the Republic would crumble, and the Jedi would be wiped out unless they had an army ready to protect them. He took that vision straight to the Jedi Council and practically begged them to prepare for war. They dismissed his warnings as dangerous paranoia. The Jedi didn't believe in building armies. They were keepers of the peace, not soldiers. After all, if the Jedi were going to start training for war, wouldn't that mean admitting the Republic was doomed? So, Separatist went rogue. With no approval and no budget, he took matters into his own hands. He reached out to the Kaminoans, famous across the galaxy for their precision cloning technologies, and made a deal. He claimed the Galactic Senate had authorized the creation of a clone army to defend the Republic. He didn't have the money to back it up, but the Kaminoans believed him. More importantly, they got paid. Somehow, Separatist arranged funding through back channels. His plan was real, up and running, and very much off the books. And that's when Darth Sidious found out. It's still unclear exactly when or how Sidious got wind of the project, but one thing's certain, he saw opportunity. He realized that this rogue Jedi had unknowingly laid the perfect groundwork for what the Sith had been planning for a millennium. Not only had someone already approached the Kaminoans and secured a clone army, but the Jedi didn't even know it existed. Sidious didn't need to build an army. He just needed to hijack the one already being built. So he sent Count Dooku, still relatively fresh in his Sith apprenticeship, to clean things up. Separatist was sent on a diplomatic mission to the moon of Umbara by Chancellor Valorum. He never came back. The Pikes, a powerful crime syndicate, were hired to take out his ship. It was shot down. Separatist died in the crash, along with his aide Silman, or so it seemed. Silman actually survived and was taken prisoner by the Pikes. Dooku arrived soon after, retrieved Separatist's body, and disposed of it on Felucia. He staged it to look like the Jedi had died during a local dispute, just enough confusion to cover the tracks and erase the truth. To Kaminoans, this was just business. They'd been told Separatist had backing from the Senate, and now Tyrannus claimed to be continuing the project on his behalf. The Kaminoans didn't ask questions. They had contracts, credits, and cloning vats to manage. From this point on, the Sith had full control of the clone army project. The Jedi still didn't know the army existed, and once everything was in place, the Separatists formed, the clones growing in tanks, the Republic trembling with fear, all Sidious had to do was light the match. He didn't need to start the war himself. He just made sure enough people were scared and angry and greedy that the war started on its own. He arranged a crisis here, a blockade there, a failed negotiation, or a Jedi assassination. The Clone Wars began. The Republic voted for emergency powers, the Jedi became generals, the galaxy polarized into two sides, and every step brought Sidious closer to total control. All while he played both sides like a maestro. To the Jedi, he was the wise Chancellor, holding the Republic together. To the Separatists, he was the dark whisper behind Dooku's shoulder. And to the corporations, he was a silent partner who never asked too many questions, as long as the factories kept running and the droids kept marching. What's terrifying is that no one saw it. So let's talk about the other faces of the Separatist movement. You know, the guys who somehow ended up running a galaxy-wide war, despite having the energy of confused accountants and customer service reps. Take, for example, that guy from the Phantom Menace. You probably remember him as the one who looked constantly stressed, had a voice like a protocol droid, and couldn't string together a sentence without panicking. That was Nute Gunray, the Viceroy of the Trade Federation, and possibly the least intimidating villain in galactic history. If the Separatists had a Mount Rushmore, his face would still be carved, looking nervously to the side mid-sweat. And yet somehow, this awkward Neimoidian bureaucrat ended up being the face of a galactic rebellion. Not because he was charismatic, not because he had military brilliance, but because he had a talent for one thing: surviving, failing, and still showing up in the next board meeting like nothing happened. Let's rewind to the beginning of this career path. Nute Gunray wasn't a warlord or a political visionary. He was a career bureaucrat, a product of Neimoidian culture, which, let's be honest, encouraged cowardice as a survival tactic. Neimoidians valued profit and stability, and most of their military was outsourced to droids because no one actually wanted to fight. Gunray, in particular, climbed the ranks of the Trade Federation, not through boldness, but through the kind of paperwork mastery that would give C-3PO a headache. His big break came when he decided to block trade routes to Naboo, because Darth Sidious told him to, and Nute, being Nute, didn't ask questions. His entire invasion of Naboo was based on instructions from a mysterious cloaked man who showed up as a hologram and gave vague, ominous commands. That's how little agency Gunray actually had. He wasn't leading anything. He was just following a checklist of evil emailed to him by a Sith Lord, and it went about as well as you'd expect. The Naboo invasion was a disaster. The droid army was defeated by a group of Gungans armed with energy balls. Queen Amidala literally marched into the palace and captured him. And yet, somehow, Nute Gunray wasn't fired. Instead, he went back to his Trade Federation boardroom, filed a formal complaint against Padme Amidala, and waited for his next promotion. That's the real theme of Nute Gunray's career. Constant failure, followed by more power. After the Naboo embarrassment, the Jedi should have been all over him, but the Republic's bureaucracy was so slow and useless that Gunray just went back to work like nothing happened. The Trade Federation kept its fleet, Gunray kept his position, and the Jedi kept writing stern letters. You'd think the Confederacy of Independent Systems would choose a bold, decisive figure to represent them. Someone who could rally systems, stand up to the Jedi, and give real speeches. Instead, they got Nute Gunray, a guy who looked like he was always about 5 seconds away from fainting. Even his speaking voice made people uncomfortable. Every time he talked, it sounded like he wasn't sure if the microphone was on. And he wasn't exactly a strong moral figure either. His motivation for joining the Separatists was pretty much, I still want to kill Padme Amidala because she humiliated me 10 years ago. That's the level of emotional maturity we're dealing with. During the Clone Wars, Gunray's presence in meetings was more like background noise. He wasn't giving orders, he was reacting, complaining, and nervously asking if they should retreat. He relied completely on the assurances of Count Dooku and the other Sith operatives, never realizing he was being strung along the entire time. And why would he? He wasn't in it for ideology. He didn't care about freedom from the Republic or sovereignty. He just wanted revenge and profit. And the wild part? He stayed on top the whole time. While leaders like Poggle the Lesser and Wat Tambor actually built weapons and coordinated war efforts, Gunray just sat in his fancy chair on Mustafar and let his viceroy title do all the talking. He always let someone else take the risks. He never visited the front lines. He made sure there was always at least one battle droid between him and danger. And somehow, this coward ended up as the spokesperson of the entire Separatist Council. But of course, as with all short-sighted cowards, his end came swiftly, and he never saw it coming. When Darth Sidious finally had no more use for the Separatists, he sent Anakin to Mustafar to take care of the Council. And there, sitting in his fortress, surrounded by false security and illusion, Nute Gunray waited, still thinking he was part of the winning team, still convinced the new Empire would reward him for his cooperation. When Vader arrived, Gunray didn't even try to run. He greeted him like a guest, right before being slashed down like a discarded pawn. So, after Nute Gunray's masterclass in mediocrity, let's take a stroll down to the banking clan. San Hill, chairman of the intergalactic banking clan, probably spent more time talking about interest rates than military strategy. But make no mistake, without him, the Clone Wars wouldn't have had the wars part funded. If Count Dooku was the voice and General Grievous was the arm, San Hill was the wallet, and for a time he thought that made him important. He wasn't a general, he wasn't a tactician, he wasn't even especially charismatic, but San Hill controlled galactic credit. And in the Republic, and especially in the failing outer systems, that gave you power. The banking clan held the purse strings for entire planetary economies. That meant that when the Separatist alliance needed to arm itself, build ships, design droid factories, and grease palms in local governments, it was San Hill and his droid accountants who made it happen. And when the Jedi finally noticed the clone army's existence on Kamino, it was Hill's money that had already armed a droid army of millions. Now let's not pretend San Hill did this out of ideology. He wasn't reciting anti-republic manifestos. He wasn't talking about liberty or sovereignty or corruption. He was talking about margins, debt restructuring, and asset control. If he had a catchphrase, it would have been, as per Section 7 of our agreement. What he wanted was simple. More financial independence for the banking clan, less Senate oversight, and guaranteed returns on every warship the Techno-Union slapped together. And then came Dooku. To Sandhill, Count Dooku wasn't a Sith Lord in disguise. He was a former Jedi with an impressive voice who seemed to be speaking his language. When Dooku began forming the Separatist movement, Hill saw a future where his banking clan wouldn't just influence systems, it would control them outright. No more meddling Republic bureaucrats auditing transactions. No more senators asking why a backwater system was suddenly in debt for generations. Dooku promised him freedom, and Hill brought his credits to the table. He didn't come alone. He brought the Moons, his thin-faced, long-headed species known for being cold, calculating, and not especially fun at parties. Their fortress on Moonalinst was turned into a separatist financial HQ, a place where war and economics merged with uncomfortable efficiency. The banking clan began directly funding separatist military campaigns. Entire factories were built off the back of loans. And for a while, it worked. The Republic had Jedi, but the separatists had production quotas and compound interest. But here's the thing. Sandhill believed he was funding a cause. What he was really doing was funding a trap. Hill began taking on more and more military funding, more risky investments, and more backroom deals with groups like the Techno-Union and the Commerce Guild. It wasn't about freedom anymore. It was about staying in the game. He stopped being a banker with political influence and became a bureaucrat in a war machine that didn't need him. Not really. The Clone Wars were escalating, and Sandhill's importance was quietly fading behind the explosions. By the later stages of the war, Moonalinst itself became a battleground. The Republic, sensing just how vital the planet was to separatist funding, launched a campaign to take it. Sandhill, once surrounded by layers of droid security and economic leverage, was now hiding in bunkers. The man who once signed off on droid armies now needed an actual army to keep him safe. And when Anakin Skywalker and the Republic finally broke through, Hill realized that his spreadsheets couldn't stop blasters. Of course, he didn't die there. No, that would have been too dignified. He lived long enough to retreat with the rest of the separatist leadership to Mustafar. That's where Darth Sidious sent them, told them to wait, told them they were about to be rewarded for their loyalty. Sandhill probably thought he was going to be appointed treasurer of the new empire or something. Instead, he got to see Darth Vader walk through the door. There's something almost poetic about it. A man who built his entire career around calculating risk, failing to calculate the one thing that mattered, that he was expendable, that none of his financial power ever actually protected him. He wasn't a player on the galactic stage, he was a placeholder, a signature on a dotted line. His final moments on Mustafar were not spent arguing policy or quoting contracts. They were spent in terror, trying to understand how it all went so wrong. But by then it didn't matter. The banking clan was dissolved, its assets were seized by the Empire, and Sandhill, he was just one more body in a room full of betrayed men. So let's talk about the Queen of Spreadsheets, Shumai, President of the Commerce Guild, Separatist Council member, and one of the most risk-averse, profit-focused people in the galaxy, who somehow thought backing a galaxy-wide war was a great financial investment. Shumai wasn't a warrior, she wasn't a schemer, but what she was rich. And she represented the Commerce Guild, one of the most powerful financial institutions in the Republic, second only to the banking clan in sheer economic muscle. The Commerce Guild had its fingers in everything: shipping lanes, mineral rights, corporate taxation, and vast holdings of territory with nearly unchecked control. They weren't just moving resources, they were owning the planets producing them. And Shumai? She ran the whole show like it was a quarterly report. By the time of the Clone Wars, she had turned the guild into a galaxy-spanning cartel, collecting dues from thousands of smaller corporations, extracting wealth from Outer Rim territories, and maintaining private armies to enforce her monopoly on planetary resources. All of that was technically illegal under Republic law, but let's be honest, the Senate was too deep in lobbyist credits to do anything about it. When Count Dooku came knocking with promises of a deregulated galaxy, where corporations could expand without oversight and operate without annoying Jedi peacekeepers showing up at their mining operations, Shumai didn't even hesitate. It wasn't about ideology. She didn't care about freedom from the Republic. What she saw was a business opportunity, a way to buy herself into a future where the Commerce Guild could be even more powerful than the Republic itself. So, she signed on, brought the Guild's armies with her, pledged their financial networks to the Confederacy. But here's the thing, she didn't do this as a true believer. She saw herself as a cautious investor. She even negotiated exit clauses in some of her commitments to the Confederacy, just in case the whole separatist rebellion went sideways. That's how much faith she didn't have in the cause. She just assumed the Republic wouldn't dare risk disrupting the galactic economy to fight them. Oops. What Shumai didn't realize, and what most of the Separatist Council never quite figured out, was that this war wasn't real. It wasn't about economic freedom, and it wasn't about trade laws. It was a trap, and she walked right into it with all her ledgers and cargo manifests in hand. The Commerce Guild bankrolled military production across dozens of systems. They oversaw the resource pipelines for droid factories. They managed the logistics for separatist invasions. All while Shumai kept a safe distance from the front lines, monitoring the war like a market fluctuation. Whenever the separatists won a battle, she'd treat it like a good earnings report. When they lost, she considered pulling out of the whole thing, not for moral reasons, just because it was bad for business. She never truly grasped the scale of what they were involved in. To her, the war was still a transaction. Even within the Separatist Council, Shumai was difficult to work with. She was dismissive, smug, and completely uninterested in any plan that didn't directly increase her profit margin. She rarely attended council meetings in person. Most of the time, she just sent out communications from her private compound, delegating major decisions to underlings while she focused on quarterly profits. And the worst part, she knew this was all a gamble. She wasn't naive like Nute Gunray or a true believer like Wat Tambor. Shumai actually suspected that Count Dooku wasn't telling them the full truth. She had concerns. She voiced them. She even tried to shift her investments away from direct conflict when she felt the war was dragging on too long. But by that point, she was already in too deep. She'd made too many deals. She couldn't back out without destroying her guild's reputation and its finances, so she doubled down, and that was the last bet she ever made. By the end of the war, Shumai had holed herself up on Felucia, one of the Commerce Guild's prize agricultural worlds. She assumed she'd be safe there, far from Coruscant, far from the Jedi, and surrounded by corporate security. She was wrong. The end was quick. And the Commerce Guild? It was dissolved under the Empire. Its holdings seized, its assets nationalized, its history scrubbed away. Just one more name on a long list of failed power players who thought they could turn war into a business opportunity. Shumai spent her whole career believing numbers didn't lie, but in the end, it wasn't a profit margin that killed her. It was a lightsaber. This one is more interesting. So, you've met the Trade Federation guy, you've met the banking guy, and you've probably wondered, who decided it was a good idea to let a bug in a robe join the War Council? That would be Archduke Poggle the Lesser, leader of Geonosis, self-declared architect of war, and full-time insect who somehow became a galactic warmonger. Poggle wasn't some random background character either. He played a surprisingly central role in the entire separatist movement, but like most separatist leaders, he really had no idea what was going on at all. What he did have, though, was a planet full of battle droids, an army-building factory, and the kind of blind enthusiasm that only someone with compound eyes and no understanding of galactic politics could bring to the table. It all started with Geonosis, a dusty red planet where the locals enjoyed gladiator fights, mass executions, and long walks through bug-infested catacombs. It wasn't exactly a vacation destination, but it was home to a massive droid foundry complex that made the Geonosians one of the galaxy's top weapons manufacturers. Poggle the Lesser didn't invent the idea of selling battle droids, but he certainly turned it into a booming business. And when Count Dooku came knocking, Poggle didn't hesitate for a second. Poggle signed on early. Before the Clone Wars even officially began, he pledged Geonosis and its droid factories to Dooku's separatist cause. In return, he got a seat at the war table and a sense of importance he had never dreamed of back when he was just yelling at other bugs in a hive council. Suddenly, Poggle the Lesser was rubbing elbows with trade barons and banking moguls, even if none of them actually respected him. And everyone silently agreed that he smelled like dirt. But to be fair, Poggle did contribute something meaningful. Droids. Thousands and thousands of them. He didn't design the B-1 battle droids, Those were already in production by the Trade Federation, but he built the massive foundries that cranked them out. Geonosis became the assembly line of the Separatist war machine. Poggle's factories could create an army in days, and it was this capability that gave the Separatists their massive early advantage. He also took a very personal interest in weapons of mass destruction. You remember the Death Star? Yeah, Poggle helped design it. In fact, it was Geonosis where the first prototype was drawn up. The original plans were secretly passed to Count Dooku, who took them to his Sith master. So while Poggle may not have had the ambition to build the galaxy's most terrifying superweapon himself, he was still the guy who said, "Sure, I'll help with the Doomsday project." But here's where things start to fall apart, mostly because Poggle never actually understood how the Sith operated. Like most of the Separatist Council, he thought he was working toward a new political order, independence, prosperity, maybe even a slice of power in the post-Republic world. What he didn't realize was that he had already been sold out. From the moment he joined, he was nothing more than a pawn, just another loud insect used to justify a war that was never supposed to be won. When the Clone Wars broke out and the Republic invaded Geonosis, Poggle didn't exactly shine as a military commander. He ran, he scurried off with Count Dooku, leaving his planet and his fellow bugs to get flattened by clone troopers. That would become a pattern. Whenever things got hot, Poggle was gone. Every time the war shifted, he ducked and covered, probably wishing he could just go back to running executions in the arena. He did stick around long enough to cause some real damage though. During the war, he backed the development of the Brain Worm Project, a nightmarish little side quest where Geonosian parasites were used to mind control clone troopers. You know, because building millions of droids wasn't evil enough. This little horror story didn't go very far, but it showed that Poggle was more than just a factory manager. He was willing to experiment, and not in a healthy way. Eventually, Poggle got captured by the Republic. He was interrogated, questioned, and probably had a translator droid trying its best to understand his angry bug clicks. He didn't reveal much, and the Jedi, bless them, still hadn't figured out they were being played by the Sith. Poggle was eventually sent back to the Separatists in one of those political prisoner trades that aged very poorly in hindsight. Fast forward to the final days of the war, and Poggle found himself holed up on Mustafar with the rest of the Separatist Council, waiting for the victory they were told was coming. What they got instead was Darth Vader. You probably know how that ended. If you blinked during the Separatist Council scenes, you probably missed him. And if you didn't, you probably still asked, wait, who was that again? That's Passel Argente, Senator of the Corporate Alliance, and possibly the least memorable Separatist in the room, which is saying a lot when you're seated next to a guy literally named Poggle the Lesser. But don't let his background actor energy fool you. Argente was part of something massive. The Corporate Alliance wasn't just some minor business interest. It was one of the most powerful trade and banking syndicates in the galaxy. It had its own fleets, its own army of combat automata, and perhaps, most importantly, its own lobbyists. And Passel Argente was their chosen voice. That's right, the guy who looked like he'd rather be doing his taxes than starting a war was one of the most influential corporate power brokers in the galaxy. He came from Kuriva, a planet known for its strategic location and economic opportunism. Kuriva didn't care who won, Republic, Separatists, Hutts, Jawas with calculators, as long as the trade lanes stayed open and the credits kept flowing. So it's no surprise that Passel wasn't exactly a firebrand revolutionary. He didn't join the Separatists because he believed in Dooku's vision of freedom. He joined because the Republic was starting to crack down on the kind of backroom dealings and monopolistic practices the Corporate Alliance was built on. See, by the final years of the Republic, the Senate was slowly realizing that letting mega corporations write the law was maybe not such a good idea, and Argente's friends were losing influence. The banking clan, the Trade Federation, the Commerce Guild, all of them were feeling the heat from regulation and Jedi oversight. So what do you do when your galactic Ponzi scheme is threatened? You pivot, you rebrand, you call yourself pro-secession, and say you're fighting for the freedom of Outer Rim systems. Then you pour trillions of credits into war droid factories and start lobbying for weapons contracts. Argente was very good at all of that. Too good, actually. He made sure the Corporate Alliance could legally supply battle tanks and enforcement droids to any planet willing to sign their terms. Those droids, of course, found their way to separatist battlefronts. and when someone at the Senate asked questions, Argente had an answer, full of jargon, loopholes, and endless footnotes. If there was an award for most boring evil, he would have won it annually. While other separatist leaders were out there shouting about liberation, Passel was whispering about supply chains. His war was fought in spreadsheets, not skirmishes. He helped fund the Confederacy's armies, but not because he cared about their cause. He saw the Clone Wars as the greatest investment opportunity in history. Every battle meant a new planet to rebuild. Every crater meant more contracts. Peace wasn't profitable, but endless low-intensity war, that was the jackpot. On the Separatist Council, Passel Argente rarely spoke up. When he did, it was to propose tighter control over trade negotiations, or to voice concern that someone was cutting into the corporate alliance's margins. In meetings with Dooku, he kept his head down and his language neutral. He didn't want to stand out. He just wanted to keep his seat at the table, and the flow of credits steady. In fact, he probably saw the whole war as one long board meeting, except the snacks were worse, and everyone around him kept mysteriously dying. And of course, as with all things separatist, he had no idea that Sidious was orchestrating the entire conflict. To him, Dooku was just another charismatic politician he could manipulate or bribe. He didn't realize he was being played until it was far too late, until Anakin Skywalker walked into that lava-lit conference room, and in the end, he was as expendable as the droids he helped finance. He died the way he lived, quietly, unceremoniously, in the background of a much more important story. His entire legacy was erased with a few swings of a lightsaber, and the corporate alliance was dissolved the moment the Empire took power. All those factories, all those trade routes, all those slimy contracts, gone, swallowed up by imperial nationalization. But Passel Argente's story is still important, because it reminds us that wars aren't just fought by heroes and villains, they're built, engineered, by bureaucrats, by quiet men in suits who know how to move credits through 10 different systems before anyone notices. So we spoke about the separatists. We went through the Trade Federation's board meetings, the soulless banking scams, and every single leader who somehow made things worse with each word they spoke. But there's something we haven't talked about yet, the actual war, because behind the hologram calls and cowardly council sessions, real people were dying. Real planets were being ripped apart. And on the ground, this wasn't a clean corporate takeover. It was clone troopers losing their brothers in mud and fire. It was Jedi, born into peace, suddenly turned into military generals. Some adapted, some didn't survive long enough to even try. This was the Clone Wars. And if you want to understand how far the galaxy fell, how the Jedi lost their clarity, how Anakin Skywalker lost his grip on who he was, you need to look at the war that reshaped it all. The war would last only a few years, but in that time, the Republic would fight hundreds of battles across thousands of star systems. Some of them were quick and silent, skirmishes that never made it into the archives. Others became turning points in the war, moments that defined the future of key characters. Jedi would rise, Jedi would fall. Clone commanders would earn their names in the heat of battle, and entire worlds would become footnotes in a galactic conflict that was never meant to be won. So let's start at the beginning. The Battle of Geonosis wasn't just another confrontation, it was the moment the galaxy tipped into total war. Up until that point, the separatists were still pretending they might just walk away, sign a treaty, split off, maybe slap the Republic with a few economic sanctions and be done with it. But then Obi-Wan Kenobi got captured. He'd followed the trail of a bounty hunter, Jango Fett, to a strange and dusty red world run by bugs and machines. Geonosis. What he uncovered there wasn't just a single droid factory or a smuggler's den. It was a war machine, already built, already massive, and the Republic didn't even realize it until it was too late. Anakin and Padme chased after Obi-Wan, because of course they did. They were reckless and loyal and already halfway in love. They got captured too, and all three were sentenced to die in a coliseum, surrounded by thousands of screaming Geonosians. That's when Mace Windu showed up. He brought a strike team of Jedi and dropped them into the arena like peacekeepers, trying to stop a war that had already begun. It was chaos. Lightsabers clashing against metal, Jedi Masters holding their own for a few minutes, then getting overwhelmed. You could see it in their movements, they weren't used to this. The Jedi weren't warriors, not like this. Then, Just as it looked like the entire order was going to be wiped out in one afternoon, the clones arrived. Yoda showed up in a gunship. The Grand Army of the Republic, a military force no one even knew existed yet, stormed Geonosis, LAATs flying through the smoke, RTT walkers stomping across the battlefield, thousands of genetically identical soldiers moving in perfect coordination, answering to Jedi who had no idea what they were commanding. This was the first time the Republic and the Separatists clashed openly, and it was brutal. The droid army was huge, endless ranks of B1 and B2 units, tanks, spider droids, buzz droids and worse. But the clones pushed through. They fought smart, they fought hard, and they won. But it didn't feel like a victory. Count Dooku escaped, Obi-Wan and Anakin chased him, and Anakin nearly died trying to take him alone. Yoda had to face his old student in a duel that left no one satisfied. In the end, the Separatist leadership lived to fight another day. Still, the damage was done. The Senate now had proof of a real enemy. The Jedi were pulled into the war as commanders, and the clones, bred in secret, trained for nothing but this, were now the face of the Republic's future. Geonosis wasn't just a single moment, it was the fuse. And from here, the war would only get messier. Battle of Ryloth. Ryloth wasn't just another target. This planet was home to the Twi'leks, a proud people, caught between invaders they didn't ask for, and liberators they weren't sure they could trust. It wasn't a quick battle either. This was one of the Republic's first major campaigns, where everything had to be coordinated. Space, land, and hearts. Because while blaster fire wins a firefight, you can't occupy a planet with just explosions and good intentions. So let's set the scene. Ryloth was under brutal separatist occupation, and it wasn't some passive blockade either. Wat Tambor decided to treat the entire population like test subjects in a hostile lab experiment. He funneled droid forces across the planet, drained local resources, and instituted what can only be described as a scorched hope policy. Twi'leks were starving, sick, and scared. Entire towns were evacuated just to make room for droid supply lines. And any sign of resistance? Tambor responded by leveling neighborhoods. The Republic's plan was to liberate the planet in stages. It wasn't just drop the clones and go. It was a three-pronged assault. Classic Republic over-planning meets desperate necessity. First came the space battle to take out the Separatist blockade. Anakin Skywalker, as always, didn't follow the rulebook. He charged a cruiser right into enemy lines like it was a pod race. Everyone watching probably had a heart attack, but it worked. He sacrificed his own ship to break the blockade and cleared the way for reinforcements. From there, it was on to the surface, and this is where the Clone Wars got personal. On the ground, things were a nightmare. The Separatists had dug in, and Wat Tambor had zero interest in being strategic. He wasn't looking to win, he was trying to make an example. He ordered droids to hold positions no matter the cost, and worse, he began pulling civilians into the line of fire, intentionally keeping them in the cities to act as living shields. This wasn't just a battle anymore, it was an ethical disaster in progress. Enter Jedi General Ima Gunray, not the most famous Jedi in the galaxy, but absolutely one of the bravest. With limited forces and no backup in sight, he teamed up with Captain Keeley and the local Twi'lek resistance. Their job was simple on paper: hold the line long enough for supply ships to get through. In reality, they were buying time with their lives, and they knew it. Keeley and Dai made their stand outside Narbat, and it was brutal. Droids kept coming, ammo ran out, positions were overrun, but they didn't leave. They stayed, to the very end. Captain Keeley died in the dirt, fighting beside the people he'd sworn to protect. Ima Gunray followed not long after, cut down while covering the last evacuees. And maybe, for once, that sacrifice wasn't in vain, because those supply ships did make it through. By the time Mace Windu arrived for the final push, the tone had shifted. This wasn't about military conquest anymore. The Jedi needed the Twi'leks on their side, not just logistically, but spiritually. So Windu did something most Jedi usually avoided. He talked to people. He negotiated with the Resistance, led by Cham Syndulla, a name that would echo far beyond this war. Cham didn't trust Windu, not at first. Why would he? The Republic had ignored his people for years, and now they suddenly cared because it was strategic. But Windu was smart. He led the charge against Wat Tambor's stronghold himself. Side by side with Cham's fighters, Windu smashed through droid lines with classic Jedi precision. But what really made the moment iconic? Wat Tambor tried to pull one of the most cartoonishly villainous moves of the entire war. As the Republic and the Twi'leks closed in, Tambor refused to retreat, not because of strategy, not because of pride, but because he hadn't finished looting the place. He had crates of stolen tech, art and weapons to load onto his ships. While cities were burning, he was arguing with droids about how many artifacts he could steal before escape. He even activated bomb droids to level the capital as a final goodbye. Spoiler, it didn't work. Windu disarmed the bomb droids, captured Tambor, and handed the planet back to its people. The Twi'leks didn't cheer for the Republic. Not exactly, but they respected what Windu and the clones had done. It wasn't a clean victory, but it was something. The Battle of Ryloth didn't just show off the scale of the Clone Wars. It exposed the messy, human side of it, the difference between Jedi idealism and separatist cruelty. And maybe most importantly, it showed that clones weren't just tools of war. Keeley didn't die for a strategy. He died for people he barely knew, and that matters. For the Republic, it was a key strategic win. For Ryloth, it was liberation at a devastating cost. And for Wat Tambor? Well, turns out being a greedy war profiteer with no charisma isn't a great survival plan in wartime. Who could have guessed? If Geonosis was the explosive start of the Clone Wars, then Umbara was the part where everything started to crack. You thought fighting separatists was hard? Try fighting your own brothers on a planet so dark you can't see your own boots. Welcome to Umbara, the Shadow World, a meat grinder of a battlefield that tested the limits of clone troopers' loyalty, patience, and sanity. And the separatists? They were barely even the problem. Umbara was a planet locked in perpetual shadow, buried under thick clouds that blocked out the sun. You couldn't see the sky, you couldn't see the enemy. All you saw were blinding beams of plasma flashing through the fog and the twisted shapes of alien tech you'd never trained for. The Umbarans were clever. Their weapons weren't like the clunky battle droids you were used to. Their ships were smooth, silent, and deadly, and their strategies were just as alien. But none of that was the worst part. What really made Umbara infamous wasn't the enemy, it was the man leading the charge, Jedi General Poggle, a hulking basilisk with 4 arms and 2 double-bladed lightsabers. Krell was everything you didn't want in a commander. Cold, detached, obsessed with victory, no matter the cost. And it didn't take long before the clones under his command started asking questions. The kind of questions that could get you killed. See, Krell didn't treat clones like soldiers. He treated them like disposable pieces in a larger strategy. He sent squads into ambushes without support. He ignored intel. He ordered charges into fortified enemy lines with no cover. If a platoon was wiped out, Krell didn't flinch. They served their purpose, he'd say, like they were just gear that broke during use. To the outside galaxy, the Republic was liberating, but if you were on the ground, it didn't feel like liberation. It felt like a slow, confused grind through a hostile jungle of mist and violence, where every order felt like a death sentence, and the only thing keeping the morale together was the bond between brothers. Captain Rex, always the loyal soldier, tried to follow orders, but even he started to doubt Krell's judgment when men he'd fought with for years died senselessly. Fives and Jesse, soldiers with hearts and voices, not numbers, were among the first to speak up. And when Hardcase, the reckless but loyal clone, with a smile too big for war, sacrificed himself to destroy a supply ship, it broke something in them. They weren't fighting for the Republic anymore. They were fighting to protect each other from their own general. And then came the moment that defined Umbara. Krell issued an order for the 501st to engage what he claimed were retreating Umbaran, forces disguised in stolen clone armor. But they weren't Umbarans. They were clones, brothers. Krell had tricked them into fighting each other, leading 2 regiments into a brutal, chaotic clash. It was a massacre, brother killing brother, because a Jedi general lied to them. When the truth came out, it was fury and a cold realization. This war wasn't about good versus evil. Not always. Sometimes it was about surviving the people above you. Eventually, the clones disobeyed Krell's orders. They staged a mutiny. Not because they were traitors, but because they couldn't stand by and watch more lives thrown away. They captured Krell, and then came the part no clone was trained for: justice. How do you execute a Jedi? Krell stood in his cell, unrepentant. He told them he saw a new future for the galaxy, that the Jedi were weak, the Republic broken. He claimed that the Separatists would lose, but the Republic would rot from the inside. And when it fell, he planned to side with the real power he sensed rising in the shadows. He had already turned. Krell had forsaken the Jedi. He had been playing both sides, using the clones to wear each other down for his own ambitions. When Dogma, the most by-the-book clone of them all, pulled the trigger, it wasn't out of vengeance. It was heartbreak. Betrayal. All those years of loyalty, obedience, honor, and the person they trusted to lead them had been using them like tools in his own power grab. The Battle of Umbara ended not with cheers of victory, but with silence. Heavy silence. The kind that hangs over a graveyard after the wind stops. They won technically. The Republic took Umbara, but no one felt like celebrating, because that campaign made something painfully clear. The war was changing them. The clones were no longer just soldiers. They were survivors, and they were starting to see that the enemy wasn't always droids or separatists. Sometimes it was the people in charge. Umbara was a turning point. It cracked the illusion that the Republic had a perfect moral compass. It made the clones question their orders, their purpose, and their place in a galaxy run by people who rarely saw them as human. It made commanders like Rex start to lead with their own judgment, not just Jedi orders. And it made Fives, the soldier who'd eventually uncover the conspiracy behind Order 66, begin his long, lonely journey toward the truth. Umbara was dark, it was tragic, but it was necessary, because in that darkness, the clones finally saw the light, that their lives mattered, that loyalty had limits, and that blind obedience could get you killed. Let's take a walk through Christophis. Christophis was beautiful once, shiny, modern, bright, a glittering capital of trade on a crystal-rich outer rim world. But by the time the Republic showed up, everything gleamed with a kind of nervous silence. Every tower was scarred, every street was trapped. The whole city had been taken by the droids, block by block, and their shimmering shield generator sat humming at the heart of it all. Like a smug little dare, the Republic had already lost a few attempts to punch through. Entire battalions had vanished, trying to breach the city's shield. It wasn't just numbers. The Separatists weren't throwing endless waves of B1s at this one. They had tactics. They had snipers perched in shattered windows, tanks buried under buildings, air support on constant patrol. And they had a leader who wasn't just playing a numbers game. They had Asajj Ventress. Now, Ventress wasn't a general in the official sense. She didn't exactly take attendance or file strategy reports, but she was the Separatists' real wild card. A dark side assassin trained by Count Dooku himself, Ventress worked in the shadows, moving among the droids and the front lines like a phantom. You'd see her curved sabers ignite in the smoke, and then gone. She demoralized troops just by being a rumor. But this story wasn't just about her. This was the battle where the Jedi had to adapt, quickly. Obi-Wan Kenobi, leading the assault from one end of the city, Anakin Skywalker, charging through the other, ignoring half the rules and rewriting the rest as he went. The two of them weren't just trying to win. They were trying to outdo each other, and the clone troopers caught between them were just hoping to survive. The real turning point came when Anakin figured out the droids weren't just fighting harder. They were fighting smarter. Every move the Republic made was being anticipated. Clone formations were flanked before they even deployed. Supplies were intercepted. Every detour they made ended in ambush. Something wasn't adding up. Eventually, it became clear. The Separatists had established a stealth-operated shield generator deep within the city, a force field so powerful that no bombardment could pierce it, and unless the Republic could take it down, they'd never take back Christophis. The plan needed to change. Enter the stealth mission. Anakin, Obi-Wan, and a small unit of clone troopers, including Captain Rex, planned an infiltration. They snuck past Separatist lines, navigating broken buildings and narrow alleys, avoiding patrols, slicing droids before they could signal. All the while, they were under constant surveillance. Ventress knew they were coming. She was just waiting for the right moment. And then came the twist. Right in the middle of this siege, a brand new Padawan dropped into Anakin's lap like a surprise gift wrapped in sarcasm. Ahsoka Tano, sent by Yoda himself. Nobody asked for this, especially not Anakin. The war was too chaotic, the mission too important. He didn't want a student, and he barely knew what he was doing himself. But there she was, bright-eyed, brave, and deeply uninterested in staying quiet or following orders. Ahsoka immediately caught onto Anakin's instincts. In the chaos of the infiltration, while troopers were dodging droid patrols and slicing through generator doors, Ahsoka kept her cool. She learned in real time. She adapted. Together, she and Anakin rigged the shield generator with explosives and blew the entire thing offline. The deflector dome shimmered, then fell. Suddenly, the city was vulnerable. Obi-Wan's forces surged forward. Republic tanks rolled through the gates that were once locked tight, and the Separatists, no longer able to hide behind energy shields, began to fall back. And just like that, Christophis changed hands. It wasn't a decisive war-ending battle, but it mattered. It was the first proof that Jedi could lead an army, that clones could win against impossible odds. It was the beginning of his dynamic with Ahsoka, the seed of trust, the start of something the galaxy didn't quite understand yet. A Jedi and a Padawan who didn't follow the rules, but who still managed to fight for something greater than themselves. For the Separatists, Christophis was a warning. The Jedi weren't going to roll over. The clones weren't just programmed pawns, and every street, every planet they tried to hold was going to come with a cost. As for Ventress, she vanished before capture, leaving only scorched metal and confused droids behind. Her presence would haunt many more battles to come. Christophis stood as a symbol of what the Clone Wars were becoming. Chaotic, personal, emotional. It wasn't just ships and droids anymore. It was loyalty. It was trust. It was ambition and fear, crashing together in the ruins of a once proud city. And for Anakin Skywalker, it was the first time he realized that war doesn't wait for permission. So, you thought Kamino was just for rainy flashbacks and staring out windows, huh? Well, turns out it also hosted one of the most intense and personal battles of the entire Clone Wars. The Battle of Kamino wasn't just a fight over a few buildings. It was a direct attempt to cut the Republic off at its source, to wipe out the entire cloning operation in one swift strike. And for the clones, this was home. They weren't defending a random base. They were defending the place they were born, raised, trained, engineered. And here is a question. Why would Palpatine greenlight an attack on Kamino? He was literally risking the destruction of the clone army he secretly controlled. Well, I have no idea. Maybe that was part of his plan. If Separatists could destroy Tipoca City and the cloning facilities inside it, they'd be crippling the Republic's ability to produce more troops. General Grievous and Asajj Ventress were both sent in, and that should tell you everything about how serious this attack was. Grievous wasn't exactly known for his subtlety, but he could lead a brutal invasion. Ventress, on the other hand, was slippery, skilled, and ruthless. Together, they coordinated a multi-phase assault, and it came from the water. Yeah, that's the twist. Kamino's above a vast ocean, and the Separatists didn't just show up with starships in the sky. They launched a full underwater assault, giant aquatic transports, swarms of aquadroids, and giant drills designed to punch straight up into the city from below. The Kaminoans weren't built for war. This was a city designed for scientific control, not frontline combat. If the clones hadn't been there, it would have been a massacre. For the clones, this was different. It wasn't a remote planet they'd been deployed to. This wasn't someone else's battle, it was theirs. You had troopers like Fives and Echo, veterans from the Rookies episode, fighting with everything they had. Not just for the Republic, but for the next generation of clones. If Kamino fell, the Vats would be destroyed, the embryos lost, and the war would shift permanently in the Separatists' favour. The Republic scrambled to respond. Jedi generals like Anakin Skywalker and Obi-Wan Kenobi were sent in to help defend the city. It wasn't clean. This was a chaotic, multi-level battle, fighting in the city, in the hangars, even in the laboratories. Separatist droids pushed into medical bays and clone nursery chambers. Every hallway had weight. Every inch of ground they lost could mean the end of the Republic's army. Meanwhile, Ventress made her move. Her objective wasn't just destruction, it was theft. She fought her way into one of the medical labs and actually stole a genetic sample of Jango Fett's DNA template. If she could escape with it, the Separatists might gain the ability to tamper with the clones' future, sabotage, overwrite, or maybe even create their own loyal clone army. She nearly succeeded. It took a brutal fight with Fives and 99, the maintenance clone. the physically defective clone who was assigned janitorial duties, but refused to sit out. He ran ammo to the front lines. He helped reload. He gave everything to save his brothers. And in the end, he was killed in action, fighting for a cause he was never even supposed to be part of. The clones won that day. The facilities were saved. The next generation of troopers would be born. But it wasn't a clean victory. It came at a cost. Kamino was no longer untouchable. The illusion of safety, gone. For the first time, the Republic saw how fragile their production line really was. And for the clones, this battle stuck with them. Most of them didn't remember being born, but they remembered defending it. Kamino wasn't just a cold ocean planet anymore. It was the place where they bled, where they lost a brother, where they realized the Separatists weren't just fighting them in the field. They were coming for their future. This wasn't just war anymore. It was personal. So you thought the Republic won on Geonosis, right? That once the Jedi and clones pulled off that messy, desperate victory in the arena and forced Count Dooku to retreat, it was all wrapped up? Nope, not even close. Turns out Geonosis had more secrets and more droids waiting underground, and the Republic, once again, had to go back to that dusty, hostile rock for another round. That's what gave us the Second Battle of Geonosis, a brutal reminder that in this war, nothing stays won for long. The objective this time wasn't just to mop up leftovers. The Separatists had rebuilt. Deep beneath the planet's crust, they were constructing a massive new droid foundry, a state-of-the-art facility capable of pumping out more battle droids than ever before, the kind of place that could completely tilt the balance of the war. So the Republic didn't have a choice. They had to go back. But this time, they'd be walking into a place they already thought they'd conquered. It was a strange feeling for the clones, and even stranger for the Jedi. It was like reopening an old wound that never really healed. General Ki-Adi-Mundi led the first wave, trying to punch a hole through Geonosis's heavy defenses to reach the factory. But nothing came easy here. The Separatists had turned the planet into a fortress. Giant ray shields covered the surface. Turbo-laser batteries, anti-aircraft cannons, and dense anti-clone infantry choked every landing zone, even with the combined strength of Jedi like Mundi, Obi-Wan, and Anakin Skywalker. Progress was slow and painful. The sandstorm-like atmosphere made air support nearly useless. Gunships were going down left and right. Just landing on Geonosis was a mission by itself. Obi-Wan's gunship was shot down during the initial descent. He survived, of course. It's Obi-Wan, but he ended up badly injured, leaving the rest of the mission to fall on the shoulders of his former apprentice. That meant Anakin and Ahsoka had to step up and lead their own assault on the droid factory, with Barriss Offee joining the effort underground. And here's where things got creepy. See? While the surface battle raged on with tanks and gunfire, the real horror waited below. Anakin and Barriss led their teams through ancient Geonosian catacombs, crumbling claustrophobic tunnels with walls that seemed to breathe. That's when they discovered that the Separatists weren't just rebuilding droids, they were experimenting. Deep beneath the foundries, brain worms, yes, literal worms, were being used to resurrect fallen Geonosians, turning them into reanimated husks controlled by a hive mind. You wanted space horror? Here you go. Barriss and Ahsoka were later trapped in the tunnels with one of these worm-infected squads. Meanwhile, on the surface, Luminara Unduli tracked down a Separatist leader hiding deep within the tunnels, Poggle the Lesser, the Geonosian Archduke who had helped start the war in the first place. She pursued him alone into the dark, believing she could take him down without assistance. But she underestimated what was waiting for her. The deeper she went, the more twisted the catacombs became, until she was ambushed by an entire nest of those undead Geonosians. She almost didn't make it out. It was one of those classic Jedi moments, conviction bordering on overconfidence. Luminara thought she could handle it because she was calm, centered, and powerful. But the truth was, she'd walked into a trap, and if it hadn't been for Anakin and Obi-Wan arriving in time to pull her out, she probably would have vanished down there without a trace. That's the theme of this entire battle, really. Repetition, futility, and slow erosion of control. This was about realizing the war wasn't something you could wrap up with a single victory. They'd fought so hard to win Geonosis the first time, and here they were again, covered in sand, knee-deep in corpses, asking themselves if anything had actually changed. Even for the clones, it was draining. And Anakin? This battle changed him in ways that were subtle but permanent. He saw Ahsoka fight side by side with Barriss, trusted her to make decisions, to lead troops, to survive horrifying conditions. And she did. But he also saw how close it all came to unraveling, how fear and infection nearly tore his squad apart. It planted more of that need for control inside him, that instinct to hold on to what he cared about a little too tightly, just in case the darkness took it away. In the end, the factory was destroyed. The Republic won, technically. So we've seen the blaster fire and chaos of Geonosis, the civilian devastation on Ryloth, and the betrayal on Umbara. But the Clone Wars weren't all fought on dusty plains or city streets. Sometimes they took place deep underwater, in environments where traditional tactics didn't mean anything, where visibility was low and blasters moved like molasses. One of the strangest and most overlooked battles of the war, the Battle of Mon Cala, or more accurately, the Civil War of Mon Cala that got hijacked by the Separatists. It was the tragic beginning of a power struggle between two native species of the planet, the Mon Calamari and the Quarren. Now, the Mon Calamari are the ones you probably know, Admiral Akbar's people. The fish-like beings with large domed heads and those wide-set eyes that make them look perpetually concerned. The Quarren, on the other hand, are the squid-faced ones. A bit more standoffish, a bit more isolationist, and historically, not too friendly with the Republic. The whole thing started when King Kalina of Mon Cala died. He had been a fair leader who kept the peace between the Mon Calamari and Quarren populations. But after his sudden and mysterious death, there was an immediate power vacuum. The Mon Calamari believed his son, Prince Lichar, should succeed him. But the Quarren, suspicious of Mon Calamari leadership and likely nudged in the wrong direction by some conveniently placed separatist propaganda, refused to recognize Lichar's rule. Tensions snapped almost overnight. The Quarren Council, with some outside encouragement, declared war. Enter the Separatists. Always eager to exploit a local conflict for their own gain, they offered assistance to the Quarren in the form of an underwater invasion force. General Nosor Ree, the leader of the Quarren isolationist movement, accepted. And just like that, the Separatist ships slipped into the Mon Cala oceans, along with fleets of aquadroids, submersible assault vehicles, and tactical support from Riff Tamsin, a Separatist commander who looked like a shark and acted like one too. And now, the Republic had no choice but to respond. But they weren't exactly ready for an underwater war. Most of their troops, ships, and Jedi were trained for standard planetary combat, not aquatic engagements. So when Jedi Master Kit Fisto arrived, he wasn't just coming to mediate a political dispute. He was entering a battlefield where the rules were completely different. Luckily, Kit Fisto was one of the few Jedi who actually thrived underwater. Amphibious by nature, with gills and a calm, diplomatic demeanor, he was the perfect figure to lead the Republic's response. Alongside him came Anakin Skywalker, Padme Amidala, and Ahsoka Tano, who was assigned to protect Prince Lichar. Their mission wasn't just to beat the Separatists, it was to protect the young prince long enough for him to win over his own people. Because that's what made this battle unique. It wasn't about capturing land or destroying droid factories. It was about legitimacy. If Lichar couldn't unite the Mon Calamari and convince the Quarren to lay down their arms, then even if the Republic won, the planet would remain fractured and ripe for future separatist influence. But convincing people takes time. And Riff Tamsin didn't care about politics, only conquest. What followed was one of the most visually wild and tactically strange battles of the Clone Wars. Clone troopers were issued specialized scuba gear, modified rifles that could function underwater, and personal submersibles to try and adapt to the new environment. But even with all that, they were at a disadvantage. Aquadroids were built for this. They glided through the water, moved in coordinated schools, and overwhelmed Republic lines with relentless pressure. Plus, the Separatists had droid subs, heavily armoured, torpedo-equipped beasts that swam circles around the Republic's meagre fleet. Early on, the Republic was losing, badly. Prince Lichar was brave but inexperienced, and the moment it became clear he was a political target, Riff Tamsin made it his personal mission to eliminate him. He led search parties, assassins, and frontal assaults just to flush the prince out and deliver a killing blow that would end the monarchy for good. One of the most harrowing parts of the battle was when Lee Cha and Ahsoka were forced into hiding in the deep trenches of the Mon Cala city. Surrounded by broken coral structures and stalked by shark-like patrols, they became guerrilla fighters. And Ahsoka, despite the environment being completely unnatural for a Togruta, stayed by his side the entire time. It was during these dark hours that Lee Cha finally began to understand what leadership meant. Meanwhile, Republic reinforcements were trickling in. Commander Gree and other clone units dropped in to support what was left of the underwater front, and in a last-ditch effort, the Gungan Grand Army, yes, Jar Jar's people, volunteered to assist. Say what you want about Gungans, but when it comes to underwater combat, they know what they're doing. Their electropole weapons and energy shields actually gave them a fighting chance against the aqua droids. With Republic strength restored and Lee Cha stepping into his role as a true leader, the tide began to turn. Literally. In a dramatic final confrontation, Lee Cha publicly confronted Rift Tamsin, rallying both Mon Calamari and Quarren citizens to unite against the real threat, the Separatists who had manipulated their civil war for personal gain. Tamsin tried to execute the prince, then and there, but it backfired. The Quarren Council, realizing they'd been used, withdrew their support, and in an act of poetic justice, Lee Cha activated explosive charges that blew Tamsin to pieces, ending the battle in one brutal, symbolic moment. With Tamsin dead, the Quarren and Mon Calamari signed a new peace. Lee Cha was crowned king, and the planet remained loyal to the Republic for the rest of the war. Felucia was never supposed to be a centerpiece in the Clone Wars. Tucked away in the Outer Rim, the planet looked more like a nature reserve than a battlefield. Giant mushrooms, towering coral-like structures, and a constant bioluminescent glow made it feel dreamlike, almost gentle. But beauty in Star Wars rarely means safety, and Felucia would soon become a haunting symbol of how quickly paradise can fall apart. So, why Felucia? Why send battalions of clone troopers and Jedi into this strange fungal jungle? The truth is, the Separatists weren't just fighting to hold territory, they were trying to disrupt Republic supply lines. Felucia had become a key waypoint for trade convoys moving from the core worlds to the far Outer Rim. If the Separatists could cut it off, they could effectively isolate entire regions and starve Republic campaigns of reinforcements and supplies. The Republic, of course, couldn't let that happen. The First Battle of Felucia took place early in the war. At the time, the Separatists were aggressively pushing into the Outer Rim, and Felucia became one of their first conquests. Droids swarmed the surface, quickly overwhelming the Republic's thin defences. The loss wasn't just military, it meant the Republic's convoys were now exposed, and it sent a clear message. The war wasn't going to stay on the core world's doorstep. The Outer Rim was now a live battlefield. Later on came the Second Battle of Felucia, chronicled in the Clone Wars animated series. By then, Felucia had become a tug-of-war world. The Republic launched a renewed effort to liberate it, this time deploying more experienced commanders and larger battalions. Jedi generals like Anakin Skywalker and Obi-Wan Kenobi participated in these campaigns, using fast-moving offensives to dislodge entrenched droid forces hiding in the thick alien vegetation. But the planet didn't make it easy. Felucia's bizarre ecosystem constantly interfered with vehicles, communication gear, and even clone trooper health. Strange spores, aggressive plant life, and roaming beasts turned every march into a survival mission. But the final and most tragic of these encounters was the Third Battle of Felucia, also known as the Felucia Campaign, during the Outer Rim sieges. It was one of the very last battles before the end of the war, and the beginning of something far darker. The Jedi High Council assigned General Aayla Secura to oversee operations there. Alongside her was Commander Bly and the 327th Star Course, elite troopers known for their adaptability and coordination. Aayla was well respected, admired by her clones for her calm leadership and her refusal to treat them as anything less than individuals. On Felucia, that bond would be tested in ways no one saw coming. The terrain itself was the first challenge. Droids, on the other hand, didn't care about mud, spores, or hostile wildlife. The Separatists knew this and exploited it. They used local Felucian beasts as biological weapons, often unleashing stampedes in the middle of Republic encampments. They also embedded their droid factories into the natural formations of the jungle, making them hard to find, let alone destroy. What followed wasn't a single battle, but a long grinding campaign. A slow bleed through alien fog and colourful shadows. The Republic pushed forward inch by inch, rooting out pockets of separatist resistance while trying to avoid ambushes from the terrain itself. But the real tragedy of Felucia wasn't strategic. It wasn't even about the outcome of the campaign. It was what happened at the end. When Order 66 was issued, it was on Felucia that the true cost of the Jedi's role in the war became clear. In the blink of an eye, everything she had built with her men, all the loyalty, trust and mutual respect, meant nothing. You could say the Confederacy of Independent Systems was doomed from the moment Count Dooku shook Darth Sidious's hand. Maybe even before that, the whole war was built like a house of cards on top of a sinkhole. Sure, the Separatists had money, factories and some of the scariest droid manufacturing plants in the galaxy. But what they didn't have, what they never had, was a future. It's kind of poetic when you think about it. Here you had thousands of star systems breaking off from the Republic, claiming to fight for independence, trade freedom, justice and all that. But behind every polished senator and business guild rep, there was a shadow. And that shadow belonged to Darth Sidious. The Separatists weren't supposed to win. They weren't even supposed to survive. Their whole job was to fight just well enough to keep the war going, and then, slowly, quietly, die off when the time came. That was the plan from day one. Their victories, allowed, their losses expected, their leaders, disposable. Think about it. They had General Grievous, a terrifying presence on the battlefield, turned into a coughing scarecrow after an encounter with Mace Windu. Even Dooku himself, he thought he was playing some brilliant long game. But the truth is, he was just another mask Sidious wore until Anakin Skywalker came along. The clone army, produced in secret, paid for by a republic that didn't even know it was funding its own military dictatorship, was never meant to be a temporary force. It was built for one thing, to win and then turn, and it did. When Order 66 hit, the Separatists were already spent. Their droid armies shut down like light bulbs in a blackout, their leaders cornered and slaughtered, and what remained? A few empty halls on Mustafar. Silence, nothing else. And let's be real, the Separatists weren't built on trust or loyalty. They were an alliance of scared corporations and egotistical warlords. The Trade Federation wanted profits. The banking clan wanted control. The Techno Union wanted freedom from regulation. And none of them trusted each other. You could feel it in every Separatist council meeting. The tension, the suspicion, the way Wat Tambor fiddled with his dials like someone might stab him mid-sentence. It was a committee of cowards. The Jedi never saw the truth because they were too focused on putting out fires. But Palpatine? He was the one lighting them. He needed a crisis big enough to justify emergency powers. A war scary enough to convince the Senate to trade liberty for security. And he got it. Every Separatist victory gave him more power. Every defeat made the Republic look like it needed stronger leadership. It was a win-win for him alone. By the time the Separatists realized the game was rigged, it was already over. The clones were marching, the Jedi were falling, and their so-called ally, Darth Sidious, was standing atop the ashes, wearing the title of Emperor. So yeah, the Separatists never had a chance. Their war wasn't just a lie, it was a trap, a tool, a performance. And they were the actors who didn't know the script ended with them being written out entirely. And maybe the saddest part? Some of them believed they were doing the right thing. Some of them thought they were building a better future. But in the end, the galaxy didn't remember them as freedom fighters. It remembered them as the other side of Palpatine's coin. That's what makes the Clone Wars so haunting. Because when the dust settled, when the last droid was powered down, and the last Separatist leader silenced, the Republic was gone too. And in its place stood an empire built on betrayal, manipulation, and war crimes dressed up as justice. So the next time someone says the Separatists could have won, remind them of this. You can't win a war when the man you're fighting is also the one feeding you orders. And that is how the galaxy lost its way.